one refutes within, one kind of negates by emptiness, or one negates within emptiness. So there's two ways of saying it. It kind of is refuted by emptiness. If it were to mean here the mind that realizes emptiness, then we would say by emptiness. So by the mind that realizes emptiness, there's a negation that takes place. But here what Kulalama Rinpoche usually explains is that these words here could also be translated as being negated within emptiness. So His Holiness has mentioned this on several occasions, that you can take that one line as in like meaning being negated within or within emptiness. So this is very similar to what His Holiness also said earlier on, the one who goes within suchness is the Tathagata. So this kind of within, the sense of within, this is something His Holiness has mentioned on several occasions. So not being negated, not getting negated by emptiness, but within emptiness.
那由于空洞喇嘛人界在中观众会用解释上是这样说的，那所以他就如何的解释刚才我们讲到的那两段。
Are there any questions?
有问题可以提出来。
可是这个他们，可是这个手机这个就这个在下天。明白是啊。这个明白，绝对被我猜错。绝对被我到了。
现在为止呢，有些一般的，公办一般的，那有些那些的，公办内陆什么这个当然，都当了下回。可是呢，对公办给呢，内陆什么就是什么了，那先把了氧气的没办法的，公办一般是什么了，我对内陆什么就把是什么了呢？先把了氧气的没办法的。因为这公办呢，民办的呢，公办内陆是马路办的，公办东西加入了。因为这那些地方呢，对，他是呢，怎么把它这个才能明白的？
公办印巴接了，他就是两来的，他就是谁的了？他你公办印巴是哪下是吧？公办印巴公办内陆是马路办的，去年的为是。现在没录了。第一呢，第到这边到我们那边是第二的。
So, like for example, being a vase, not being the mode of existence of the vase, is that the emptiness of the vase. So the vase, being vase, that not being the mode of existence of the vase, is that emptiness. So isn't that something that also the followers of the Satantrika school would say? So that the vase not being by way of its own nature the basis for the conceptual consciousness state of vase. So it's just a different way of saying it. So the way the other Geshe expressed it was like saying being vase, that itself not being the nature of the vase, is not being the mode of existence of the vase. So that if that's emptiness according to the Chittamatra school, well, that is also would realize. So would that mean that the emptiness described in the Chittamatra school is realized by the followers of the Satantrika? Because they would also say that being a vase is not established as being the actual mode of existence of the vase. They would also accept such not being established, such lack of establishment, and so therefore it would absolutely follow they would realize the emptiness of the Satantrika.
像澎湃那那他给西的做个做生的觉得没在行了多了吧？就是他澎湃引把些的到被大把咱们来是，对他对吧呢？甚至么你个一来个， 디지도 부바 임바데 부베네루 마레스 네루스 투비오 마레스 니가 일라고ар 제산다 부바 임바데 부베네루스 마주바디 돈이 일라나디 도데베게 또그르베스 센제미시비 돈이디 도데베 또투 마르바.
This is based on the idea that the emptiness according to the Chittamatra school cannot be realized by the followers of the Satantrika school. So here when we talk about the vase, the basis for saying vase, so the basis is that inexpressible object, the vase, this inexpressible substance. But being vase is not the actual vase, it is merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. It's a conventional word, it's a permanent phenomenon. So therefore, being vast, so the lack of being vast, being the mode of existence of the vast, that is also understood by the followers of the Satantrika school. And if that absence of being vast, being the mode of existence of vast itself, if that is emptiness, and then it follows, since the Satantrika school also realizes it would certainly follow that the followers of the Satantrika school realize the emptiness set forth in the Chittamatra school.
Jisanta dila du tehingin daedi. Pumba yingba pumbi sumajubas. Dila yundu. Ani ngela pumba yingba la du ne pagi shindaji li losu chi pumba seji kapsanji su ten mudo. Da di tensa di mindawe wangi. Pumba yingba la du pagi pumbi midaba pumbi cheba pumbi ki tingi kiju. Shinda dili losu pumba yingba sun su kije. Di in pumbi nilu su tuyo mare lamna. Dodebege totugo res. Dili losu, pumbi cheba, pumbi midaba, dili losu pumba yin la di tobe taba res. Sen dili losu che di tobe chewa res. Kozu ngojik res. Keje di tobe yo yin zang, pumba yinba pumbi nilu suma chuba, tindegi yinba pumbi nilu suma chuba laba yina, dodebe togo re rakwa res.
So when we talk about here, the vase, being vase, is not the mode of existence of the vase. So being vase here, kind of separating it out. For example, we say the impermanence of vase, being a product of vase, we can't really separate those out. So separating this out as being something separate, so not being able to actually separate it out, this means, this is what the Satantrika school also accepts here. They also understand that being a vase actually, when you look at it, is the same as the impermanence of the vase, it's the same as being a product. All this, the thing that you point at is the same phenomenon. So you separating it out is merely imputed by conceptual consciousness. You just crystallize it out, or you just make it separate conceptually, but in actuality you can't really separate it. So this is also what the Chittamatra, what the Satantrika school understands.
That which young in Pumba Yimba Sudi and Punzi Mishili Losu Chen. Losu Chen and Pumba Yimba, Sinki on Deep Binilus Majuba Nadu, and Sense Mishibi Tony Dires. Carisana, Di Tobe Tabare Sudi, Mishili Losu Che, the Tobe Chevare Mato, when Nechila Mishili Losu Yoma is Zay on it, or did go out the little Barba.
So here, using the same words, saying being a vase, it cannot actually be separated now from the mind that perceives, the eye consciousness that perceives the vase. So if that were to be separated out, really separated out, that's impossible, because there are one nature. So it's merely imputed by a conceptual mind. Only conceptually we can separate the vase from the eye consciousness that perceives the vase. But in actuality, it doesn't exist as separate. So this is what the followers of the Chittamatra school would say. So according to the Chittamatra school, the vase does not actually, by way of its own nature, exist separate from the awareness that perceives the vase, from the eye consciousness that perceives the vase. So use the same kind of words here, but it's a different kind of explanation that is given, that is here only accepted by the Chittamatra school.
That Pumba Yimba Sudi, and Biki Shindali Losu Che di Todevi Kijerva, and Michele Losu Che di Sense Bigijerva. That Pumba Yimba Sudi, Pumba Kurama Yingi Kavala Soba, di Tamjeli Losu Chen, Pumba Sinisha, the Dindi Yimba di Pumbenilus Matuvalana, and Tanjulu Tony Si.
So therefore here, there's different ways in which being vast, according to the Tantrika school, for example, so there's this misperception that the being vast exists as a separate characteristic, as a different nature from the vast. So there's that misperception that the Tantrika school would see as a misperception. Then according to the Chittamatra school, they would say there's this misperception perceiving being vast as separate from the I consciousness that perceives the vast. They would recognize that as a misperception. Then according to the high school, the Madhyamika school, they would say being vast as existing separate from the pillar. And so here, that would take a Geshe, does that mean independent of the pillar? That kind of misperception, that would be unique to the Madhyamika school. And Geshe said yes, so it means like a vast that exists independent of the pillar.
남제 나로라 페나 땅에 달 너무 뭐지 비슷해 라마선데 니마타와 텐데라 인주다 도범 문진기지 시용도 뭐 임바다 가다 뭐미다와 임바세 도베다 좀 시고하러 우리들로 시용도 레디 무슨 송도 다데 도베다 좀 송고다 다데디 도베다 좀 인다고 송고다 제가 다데 도베다 좀 레디 임바도 도베다 좀 따다거를 내줘야지 디니네 내지를 줘야지.
So in the Pramanavartika, so it's been many years since I studied that particular text, but from what I remember, there's this topic called identifying the isolates. So here, when we speak about being a vast, that is merely imputed. So likewise, one finds this explanation of being different isolates, that is also merely imputed. So this is different. This is the same idea as in like being a vast, being different isolates. These are just merely they're accepted to just be merely imputed by conception.
明点分别心，那老师认为呢，这里讲到的明点分别心，跟刚刚我们讲到的，比如说视频是注意的那个视字的那个分别心，它要讲的意思是一样的。
가장님은 긴기송에 딜레 양조산도 시다이 가서 지라마 워주에 정주선바 이름에 기재 총선 이 카도 정주선바를 기재 마시네 따디 요리 차와디 가르스나 지라마의 정주선바디 산지 문진지에 따다리 이거 말해 이내 디 정주드니 일로 리기요나 아니 치르베기 규이 타바드니 일로디에 과랑과랑 타바 인신단 디드니로 제용디 디 타바드니로 샤구래 디 샤바이나 타바드니로 좀 많이 맞지 온디 달라나 심바기 지셔버려 치료가 솔론탑에 내려로 다 삼. 디 요다디 디로 다 지워용의 시지로.
So Vishnu said that the teacher closest to him also asked this question before with regard to whether there are followers of the Vaibhashika schools who are also bodhisattvas. Is that possible? Well, the debate is about the fact that actually followers of the Vaibhashika are unable to identify enlightenment. And is a bodhisattva is someone who has bodhicitta and therefore the aspiration to become enlightened. But is that kind of enlightenment is a different type of enlightenment as opposed to enlightenment that is set forth in the higher schools? Well, if that is still acceptable, this would follow that the non-Buddhists who set forth liberation, they have their own kind of explanation of liberation. So wishing for a non-Buddhist kind of liberation, the way it is explained by a non-Buddhist person, would also qualify for actual renunciation. So a person who has the aspiration to attain a non-Buddhist liberation, would that mean they have entered the path of accumulation? Because that is the kind of entryway to the path of accumulation. So if you don't need to identify, you don't need to aspire towards true enlightenment, the actual enlightenment, to be a bodhisattva, then it would mean you don't need to aspire towards the actual liberation in order to enter the path of
accumulation. 동맥이 자와 가르레스마 대주디 제바보 따바란 중기고 디지 컨텐츠고라 아직 방에 매기지 아니 계시 넘버는 신지시 제비원도 당내 동해 용대디 유모는 두고도 아니면 자와 아니 달라 차벌을 두고도 디자와 단신의 두고도 알라네 단신들로 양다 말레스 Pae Mingi Shayora. That Digidusane, Dile Dode, that Injichi Tone and Tarba Kiji, then the Megi Tarba Lady, down, quit Tarba Lady, Bet Kaga Langa Lamason, Cho Bet Kagachi, Kaga Imamas, Halamta, Tochola Tregi, in the Chayo Michi. In a number Samang Ichigurgi Tola, then Tony Tamji Zawa, then you want to day, you want Zawa Dala Chava, Dia Zawa Danzin the two, say Dia Geji Chibachi. Danzin say Dia, any Rangiwa, Zimba, what Zeyu de Zimba, or Rama Zimbas, Tinditi Meba, or Tindiki Tamen Kiji, the Chigur chatting each. That Nansigi any Zesu Yu said and a Taramambo, and Zesu maybe Yubi Tocho, Tai said the Taramambo. Did any Rama Meba said the Kotaramambo. Did the Duke was a Didavish Tonder, Tarba Kawayore, Lavaina. Tapena Jalati Nurbutovich Chiche and Kambachina, Kambache, Kambenalola, Rumche, Yatinalola, Gamche, Gamna Kochaja, Tinalola, Jushayana. That Chirama Kamba di Jutu Service, Chiramo the Debakira, to the Omandazi. Chirebe Kambakara Kajo is jumping into the Troy Service. That Chiramo the Debe Kamba di Jutu Inza, a Kali, the Tara and the Des Uzitoina, the Lokaji Cho, Davadi letting it. Tinti Kiva met or sometimes. Chesa. Chirama Yuji Tabatini Lodi, Tabatini Lutini Wayin, Chiribe Tabatini Lodi, Korangi Tabalane, Tabatini Lutini Mayin, and Chivarchena, there's Uzuka Meadow.
However, there is a difference between the non-Buddhist philosophers and the Buddhist philosophers, in the sense that from a non-Buddhist point of view, the root of suffering, the kind of root cause of suffering, is seen in a permanent kind of self-arisen kind of creator, as in like creating the suffering, and this is not an object of elimination. Whereas from the Buddhist point of view, we talk about the afflictions being the cause of our problems, and even taking the cause even deeper, it is the misperception of the self. Well, according to the non-Buddhist, that misperception of the self would be an accurate mind. The mind that misperceives the self according to the Buddhist, the non-Buddhist would say that this is a correct mind, that this is a mind that is in accordance with reality. And so, on top of that, so therefore, based on that kind of assertion to talk about liberation, it becomes very, very different to the type of liberation that is described in the Buddhist system. It's almost opposite. It's almost opposite to the Buddhist explanation of what is liberation from suffering. So all Buddhist tenet holders, the lower as well as the upper tenet holders, they all talk about afflictions being responsible for our suffering, and those afflictions may go back as their root. They identify the mind that grasps onto a self. A self which exists self-sufficiently, which exists substantially, which exists independently. So such a self doesn't exist, they're all the same, and asserting the non-existence of an independent, substantial, and so forth self. But here, there's different ways in which they describe, there's different kind of levels of coarsity, of coarseness and subtlety when it comes to substantial existence. So the different tenet holders explain substantial existence differently. There's different degrees of subtlety and coarseness. Likewise, with regard to the opposite of substantial existence, which is imputed existence, again, the different tenet holders describe imputed existence or being reputedly existent by way of different degrees of coarseness and subtlety. And in the same way, talking about independently existing independently. So that sense of independence, again, there are many differences from the point of view of coarseness and subtlety when one looks at the different tenet systems. So even though that's the case, nonetheless, the liberation that's set forth by the different Buddhist tenet holders is still very, very similar. So Geshe-la gave the example. Let's say liberation, as explained in the Buddhist system, were like a jewel. A jewel that you put in a box and you put it in a house. So in order to get choose the liberation, you have to find that jewel in the box. The Chitta, the Vaibhashika school, the followers of the Vaibhashika school, they can at least identify the house. They can at least kind of approach the house. Whereas the follower of the non-Buddhist school, due to their totally different assertion as to what liberation is, they would go to somewhere else. They wouldn't even move towards the house. They wouldn't even get closer. So in that sense, the Vaibhashika school, as the lowest tenet holders, they are identified as those that get closer at least to the box by approaching the house. So therefore, one can therefore say that even though followers of the Vaibhashika do not identify liberation or do not identify enlightenment and so forth in the same way as in the higher schools, but they get close enough. They get kind of close enough. So one can kind of insist here, therefore, that it is not necessary for a follower of the Vaibhashika school, for example, to identify liberation or enlightenment correctly in order to be a Bodhisattva.
ane tiji tungu maybe ten shi de la tata le tuye chi ta dina shi ane du shi chome ki je di yudu di charu chodu ane du shi chamu chom tuye di gang la tata le tuye chi din digi chani kibar desi.
So therefore, the kind of main teachings that were set forth by the Buddha, the Four Noble Truths, then here it's just a way of getting closer and closer to the Four Noble Truths, getting closer and closer, approaching the Four Noble Truths in a subtle way. This is what the different tenet schools do. Likewise, with regard to eliminating the four maras or the four Bushi or the four maras here, again, one goes deeper and deeper with regard to the different tenet schools. They go deeper and deeper as to with regard to the subtle kind of mara that they eliminate.
Ima lo shin yin di dagma res karesena nambegi taba denye lo di sangi jumne di taba khande chi yone dina shin tabna dengo res. Ne sangi jumne di taba ngone ro odi lawi kenpanen ro lai tide tutama ri taba denye lo keda ma res. Tutama wa gi taba denye lo keda ma res. tutama shingi ina ta chiki lai jero sangi odi res.
So when I was young, my sense of the kind of liberation that I want to achieve is the same as the Buddha. So I just had that sense, I want to achieve the same liberation as the Buddha. That's what I felt was the wish to become liberated. But then when he said this to Geshe Panditara, he said this is not the way a follower of a philosophical tenet looks at this. It's like it's not how a follower of the tenet system were to identify liberation. It's not just saying, oh, it's just the same liberation as the Buddha. So that's not the right way to go that way.
Kambaji pagi lasa le jo chega le insaro lasa jo chega le ane mona jama shin chi de du lasa ama chi de le amona shi ji dao do da indo ho jue yu sara sangi de mo da ya sim ji di an cha sa nye je an di che de la amala gi khari cha ba nge da ra indo.
He came to see the Buddha statue of Shakyamuni Buddha in Lhasa. And so as he approached the statue, there was an elderly lady who did really strong prayers. She did all these incredible prayers, very kind of absorbed. She very much focused on and did her kind of prayers. And since this Khampa didn't really know how to pray, so he was like, whatever this mother, whatever this Amula is thinking, whatever she praying, the same is true for me. I'm praying for this.
Tony Dana Rinpoche, Moje Lana Jekyo Jekyo Wanyam Ramya Baya Kone Ondo Dela